Music is often said to be an international language, something that transcends linguistic boundaries. Now, even if this is true, there's no denying the fact that it therefore also has regional dialects. In fact, particularly in the 19th century, inspired by movements such as Romanticism, a number of composers, like a number of authors and painters as it happens, were turning to their own native roots, the native roots of their locality or the country in which they lived and worked. And this often involved turning to and trying to recover the long-standing folk traditions of their country. As far as the United States is concerned, there wasn't much evidence of this happening in practice. To generalize, to listen to classical music composed in the United States during the 19th century, one could have been excused for thinking it had been composed in Europe. Nonetheless, as time went by, people were wondering and asking if America could produce something of its own, some kind of music that could be regarded as in some way distinctively American. Now, an important figure in this discussion was the Czech composer Antonín Dvorak, and it's significant, as we will see, that he was a foreigner. Now, Dvorak was by this point a renowned and celebrated composer across Europe. His music and he himself travelled widely and were generally pretty well received. So he was invited to the United States at the end of the 19th century in 1892, when he lived in New York. As part of that, he was commissioned to compose a symphony. By this point he'd written 8 already, so this one was his 9th, but he decided to write it about the New World, and so it today tends to be better known by the title The New World Symphony, or Symphony from the New World. Now, this is a celebrated piece in its own right, but its importance is due not least to the place it occupies in this goal to develop a distinctively American kind of music, and this is the task that Dvorak set himself. I should perhaps say that he himself, a lot of his music had become renowned because of the folk motifs of traditional Czech music that it contained. In any case, in the United States he reflected upon the state of the classical music scene there and upon what he hoped to achieve with his symphony. And this is what he said: "I am convinced that the future music of this country must be founded on what are called Negro melodies. These can be the foundation of a serious and original school of composition to be developed in the United States. These beautiful and varied themes are the product of the soil. They are the folk songs of America, and your composers must turn to them." Now, we have to remember what an extremely radical statement this was at the time Dvorak made it. In many respects he was ahead of his time. The end of the 19th century, of course, was still a period in which African Americans were given very little value at all. This was a time when there was clear apartheid, if you like, in their treatment, and white people would go en masse to watch black slaves being burnt at the stake. So for someone to come along and suggest that a whole culture, a whole musical culture, could be founded on something that comes from the African American community was really politically shocking, although we of course would think of it as enlightening. And it did cause quite a controversy at the time. Now, it's important we bear that in mind, the significance of Dvorak giving Negro culture a a very elevated status, suggesting it could be the foundation for a culture. That's not to say, though, that his statement can't be questioned from certain perspectives. For example, can we really say that the African Americans have a native tradition in their soil in the same sense that, say, maybe the Czech people had one in theirs? Because, of course, many of these people were either themselves taken directly from Africa or were the children of grandchildren who had been taken there. That's one question. I mean, of course, many of these songs, because Dvorak was mostly interested in what we call now Negro spirituals, these developed as a result of the experiences of being uprooted from your homeland and forced to move and live in these very difficult conditions. So that's one thing. But also, if we're going to talk about native peoples and folk songs, well, what about the Native Americans? Where are they in all of this? Well, Dvorak had an answer for that too. In his view, and you can see the quotation here, the music of the Negroes and of the Indians, that was the name for Native Americans then, is practically identical. Now, it should be said that by the time Dvorak composed his New World Symphony, he hadn't been outside New York, so of course he wouldn't have had the opportunity to encounter Native Americans in anything like their natural circumstances or environment. So you can either blame or forgive him for then suggesting that their music is more the same. Dvorak, though, did befriend a number of black artists whilst he was in New York, including one called Harry T. Burleigh, who was a composer and musician in his own right and took Dvorak around the city, introducing him to some of its music. So Dvorak did have an understanding of what Negro spirituals were all about. Nonetheless, he has been accused of not really living up, his practice not really living up to his words or his promise. People say, well, if this symphony is supposed to show the way for the United States of how they can base their music on Negro spirituals, well, where are the Negro spirituals, or where are the Native American melodies in this symphony? What Dvorak himself said was that, yes, it's true, I haven't taken any actual spirituals and put them into my piece, but I've somehow tried to reproduce their spirit. As you can see on the screen, he said, it is merely the spirit of Negro and Indian melodies which I've tried to reproduce in my new symphony. I have not actually used any of the melodies. Some people, though, have claimed that in parts of the symphony you can hear echoes of quite a renowned Negro spiritual called Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. If any of you actually are interested in rugby, you will often hear the supporters of the England rugby team singing this at games, but it's originally, of course, an African-American piece of music. It's actually very hard to find on Spotify a version that in any way sounds authentic, hasn't been turned into pop or very clearly Western choral music of some kind. But so I gave up on Spotify, and the closest thing I could find was this clip from YouTube. So let's listen to a bit of it.
Swing low, sweet chariot, coming forth to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming forth to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming forth to carry me home.
So that's an example of a so-called Negro spiritual. Now let's just listen to a part of the first movement of the New World, of the symphony from the New World. And, well, you can see for yourselves whether you think there any kind of spirit or echo is maintained. I'm going to play a part that's one of those sections where it's claimed that you can hear the Negro spiritual within. Let me just see. I'm going to go towards the end. Let's start around here. So some people would say that the spirit indeed is kept there, others would not. In fact, another charge that's been made against the symphony is that really what you can hear in it is Dvorak continuing to draw upon his own Czech roots and the folk traditions of his homeland that appear in his other works, and so for them there isn't any substantial difference between this symphony, the ninth one, and any of the others that he wrote. So there are a number of reasons why some people would say that, well, Dvorak's project was well-meaning and honourable, but he didn't live up to it in practice. Well, that is a point of view you can take, but it's also worth thinking about the reception that this piece received after its first performance in New York, and it was an astonishing success. It was wildly popular, and a number of people did genuinely feel that this represented, in a funny kind of way, one of the first pieces of distinctively American classical music. And this despite the fact the composer was not American, despite the fact that perhaps the native music of America wasn't obviously present there. In fact, the argument was that what made it an American piece of music was precisely its mixture, its combination, its melange of different traditions and different styles. This brings us back then again to the idea of the imaginary. What is it to be American? And this is a sense of the imaginary where being American is not about being one thing. It's not about belonging to one tradition or coming from one sort of line of either family or race or history or culture. But being American is precisely about experiencing and living this mixture of different traditions and different identities. The New York critic of the time, a man called James Huneker, this is exactly what he wrote in his report afterwards. He said, "This is a landmark composition and a distinctively American work." And this is because it was itself a composite, a combination of different elements. And this, according to Huneker, reflected the multicultural melting pot that was the United States of America.